Thank you for choosing to watch this video. Before starting, I should state that I am not a trained psychologist, nor, if my ideas are correct, do I think that Kubrick expected people to have anything more than an interested lay understanding of the subject to appreciate his film. Hopefully you'll see what I mean by that over the next 15 minutes or so. In an exclusive interview about The Shining for Michel Simon's book on the director, Kubrick specifically cited the influence of Sigmund Freud's seminal work on the supernatural, The Uncanny. In this, Freud describes at least 4 significant examples of uncanny occurrences, all of which can be seen in the film. Actually, there is also a 5th, but it involves a lengthy explanation to demonstrate why, when Jack Torrance used the word homie about their quarters, he was actually saying that they were uncanny. The first of Freud's examples is to leave the reader wondering whether a particular figure is real or an automaton, which is surely a feature of the overlooked solid-looking ghosts, such as Lloyd and Grady. In his second case, Freud cites manifestations of insanity. Although many people consider Jack Torrance to be unbalanced from the outset, he certainly seems to descend further into the depths of madness as the film progresses and culminates. Freud's third indication of the uncanny is the constant recurrence of the same thing. Now we see Jack Torrance attempting to kill his family. During the interview, we learn that Charles Grady did the same thing about 10 years previously, and during the film we learn how Delbert Grady corrected his family many years before that. So family murder appears to fit the bill as a constantly reoccurring event in the film. Last, but by no means least, Freud cites the appearance of persons who have to be regarded as identical because they look alike. Now, while it's obvious who this applies to in the film, Freud does elaborate on a further feature of the relationship between such doppelgangers. This is the spontaneous transmission of mental processes from one of these persons to another. The twin simultaneous speech certainly fits the bill in that regard. Now, in addition to the explicitly mentioned The Uncanny, researchers into the film established that Bruno Bettelheim's book, The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales, was also instrumental in the development of the script. Kubrick's own, not very heavily annotated copy of this is consultable in the archive. In this book, Bettelheim uses Freudian techniques to analyse fairy tales which we see used in the film. These include Hansel and Gretel and the 3 Little Pigs. He attributes the parents' cruelty in the former story to their poverty, and considers the latter to exemplify Freud's pleasure and reality principles. Arguably of more interest, although admittedly not highlighted by Kubrick, is the inclusion of the Grimm fairy story, Our Lady's Child. Again about parents too poor to support their 3-year-old daughter, they accept an offer from the Virgin Mary to look after her in heaven. At the age of 14, the girl is entrusted by the Virgin with the keys to 13 doors, 12 of which she may open, but not the 13th. She does, of course, open it, and is consequently rendered mute and returned to Earth. Now this is not unlike Danny, who has to rely on Tony to do the speaking for him after he's been harmed. Finally, on Freud, there is one other example I would like to bring to your attention. This, however, is not explicitly mentioned anywhere else. It's one I have inferred from evidence in the film. It concerns the scene in the Colorado lounge when Wendy discovers that Danny has been harmed. Notably, the walls to each side of the fireplace are decorated with animals, which are totemic to the Native Americans. The scene therefore combines the harming of a child, an act which must be considered a taboo, with a totemic setting. In 1913, Sigmund Freud published Totem and Taboo. Disturbingly for the plot of The Shining, its opening chapter is called The Horror of Incest. More disturbingly, the subject of incest is also explicitly shown on the cover of the Playgirl magazine, which Jack Torrance is seen reading in the reception. Now this isn't the first time such a suggestion has been made about the incident in the film. So are these actually clues as to what is going on? And if so, who is actually committing it? Of course, the other great psychoanalyst of the period was Freud's former friend and colleague turned rival, Carl Jung. Bizarrely, for an intellectual we know Kubrick revered, and who was core to his later film Full Metal Jacket, we don't see any explicit mention of him in relation to The Shining, as we did Freud in the Simon interview. But maybe Kubrick did provide a couple of very subtle hints. The first of these, as easily dismissed by skeptics as it can be seen as evidence by others, is a book located on Ullman's desk. On the side is the title, Red Book. In actual fact, the book in question is an annually published directory of hotels and motels called the Hotel Red Book, perfectly appropriate for a hotel manager to have on his desk. But quite early in his career, Carl Jung wrote a book called the Red Book. While it was known about in psychology circles, it was actually only published posthumously in 2009. So did Kubrick intend this prominent yet easily overlooked book on Ullman's desk to be an ambiguous reference to Jung? Or was it just coincidence? If you think that example is far-fetched and consider me to be reading too much into a simple, perfectly justifiable hotel guide, then at least the next clue is a definite Jungian reference. It does, however, take research, either in the archive where it exists or in the academic books which mention it, and you have to know it's Jungian. The evidence can be found in Kubrick's handwritten notes in his typed copy of The Shine, as King's novel was originally called. 3 of these notes, including one specific instruction to reread it, refer to Hermann Hesse's novel Steppenwolf. The main character in Steppenwolf is Harry Haller. Note the coincidence between his initials and the author's. Dreamlike in style, the plot concerns the individuation of Haller. Individuation is a psychoanalytical process developed by Carl Jung, a process Hesse himself underwent with Jung's protégé J.B. Lang. Hesse did also meet Carl Jung. Haller is aided in this process by Hermina. Note also the similarity of her name to the author's. She represents Haller's anima, his feminine side, one of the archetypes which Jung defined as part of his theory of the collective unconscious. A full description of this book and its wider relation to The Shining is out of the scope of this presentation. Suffice it to say that during his psychological Jungian adventure, Haller gets to meet 2 immortal cultural icons from Germanic history. In a dream, he first meets Goethe, who speaks of the magic flute. Haller later encounters Mozart, the opera's composer. Bergman, one of Kubrick's favourite directors, did a film of the magic flute. So is it possible that Kubrick incorporated a reference to it in The Shining, as a hint that Steppenwolf was relevant? Or is this similarity of images just a coincidence? Now, if that second example leaves you as cold as the first, maybe there's another approach to Jung we can take. Maybe Kubrick thought that if he explicitly referred to Freud's research into the supernatural, we, as inquisitive viewers, might hypothesize that he had also exploited the finding of Carl Jung's research into the supernatural too. After all, Jung's supernatural research focused on ESP, which is essentially what Shining is about. He published his research in a book called Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. Synchronicity is probably one of the best known aspects of Jungian psychology, and can be defined as the coincidence of events that appear meaningfully related but do not seem to be causally connected. Well, I've just used the word coincidence a couple of times on previous slides, but you may argue that they were contrived, and to a degree you'd be right. But if Kubrick did want to employ a principle to connect elements of his film together, wouldn't synchronicity, with its roots in the psychology of the supernatural, be ideal, even if it meant needing to create the illusion of synchronicity? So, are there any other instances of coincidence we can look to in the film? Well, frankly, there are umpteen of them. The previous videos in this series are full of them, as will future ones be too. But for the sake of simplicity, let's look at the well-documented case of the coincidence of names. To start with, the novel was written by Stephen King, who was inspired to write it by a stay at the Stanley Hotel, and it was Stanley Kubrick who made the movie, and of course he shares the same initials as the author, SK. Jack Nicholson plays Jack Torrance. Danny Torrance is played by Danny Lloyd. Lloyd the barman is played by Joe Turkel, and Turkel was the character name of Scatman Crothers in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which brings us back to Jack Nicholson, who coincidentally also played Henry Lloyd Moon in Going South, as we discussed in a previous video. So are all those connections between all those names just a coincidence? Or might there have been an element of design, an intention to create an illusion of coincidence or synchronicity? If you think it's just coincidence, let me just say that in one of the film scripts in the archive, the name of Liv Ullmann was speculatively associated with Jack Nicholson, or that one of the books in the Boulder apartment was co-written by James Ramsey Ullman. Do those examples make you think twice? And is it a coincidence that pyramidal shapes on the entrance to the maze echo similar shapes on the entrance in a 1953 film actually called The Maze? And if not, Is it just coincidence that the scriptwriter's name combines both the child's and the hotel manager's? And is it cogent that Kubrick's own daughter Vivian is quoted as saying of her father, on page 481 of Vincent Labrutto's biography, that he loved coincidences? So out of respect for Kubrick's predilection for coincidence, let's cite another which has an appropriately psychological angle to it. In a previous video I suggested that Kubrick may have influenced Tobe Hooper's 1982 film Poltergeist. Now you may need to go back and watch that video in order to understand how a film which postdates The Shining can be relevant to my argumentation. But in Poltergeist, JoBeth Williams can be seen to be reading a large format copy of Carl Jung's book Man and His Symbols. This book was also available as a mass market paperback. The book was deliberately written by Jung and some collaborators for the layman, and as such acts as an excellent introduction to Jungian psychology, explaining concepts such as the collective unconscious and archetypes. Amidst other archetypes such as the anima, mother figure or wise old man, one really stands out in The Shining. At the time he decided to make The Shining, Stanley Kubrick had also been very interested in Diane Johnson's book, The Shadow Knows. In fact, he was sufficiently impressed by the book that he asked Diane Johnson to co-write the script of The Shining with him. Coincidentally, in King's novel, on page 50, he uses exactly the same phrase in the context, "How did you know that? The shadow knows. Have you been spying on me?" In Jungian psychology, the shadow archetype, in very simple terms, represents the darker side of a person's personality. These darker elements are often revealed through the process of projection, whereby someone can attribute a flaw in their own character onto another person. Could something like this be happening in The Shining? There are several other elements in the book which stand out too. On page 40, he refers to a recurring dream he experienced, in which his mother ran a hotel for ghostly visitors. He comes to associate this and other aspects of the dream with symbolic imagery contained in alchemical documents he had purchased. Alchemy plays a very significant role in Jung's theories, so don't be shocked if you see it raised again in this series. It has a rational source. Another standout element refers to the self. It reads as follows. In many works of art, the Christ child is depicted as or with the sphere of the world, a motif that clearly denotes the self. For a child and a sphere are both universal symbols of totality. Now where have we seen the depiction of a child and a sphere in The Shining? And could it be of further significance that this quotation starts on page 237? The Jungian self refers to a unified psyche, both conscious and unconscious. So if there is significant symbolism referring to the self, who's it referring to? Danny? Well, perhaps other symbolism in the film can be of help here. Arguably, the film's most symbolic feature is the maze Kubrick chose to include. Mazes have long had psychological overtones, and Jung is unequivocal about them. On page 177 of Man and His Symbols, he refers to the labyrinth as an entangling and a confusing representation of the world of matriarchal consciousness. Matriarchal consciousness? There's only one character in The Shining who that can apply to. So is Wendy the self that was being referred to? And if she is, then is The Shining taking place in her mind? And if it is, then is she recollecting Danny's abuse by Jack? Or is her shadow projecting her abuse of Danny onto Jack? Maybe we need to extrapolate this study of psychology in The Shining to a psychoanalysis of the film itself and see if it contains any evidence of psychiatric or psychotherapeutic themes. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope the content was of interest, even if the production values left something to be desired. I'm afraid I'm not too gifted in that area. Also, please remember that this is just one small facet of the puzzle that is The Shining. To learn more, you'll need to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were, and view further presentations. So if you're interested in doing that, please remember to like, subscribe and share this one. Thank you.